We're taking all the best old school wisdom and blending it with the top new school methods to bring you the optimal coaching strategies. This is the 80-20 Baseball Podcast with Coach Bo.
Welcome 80-20 baseball coaches. Glad to be here with all of you. Thank you for showing up. We're going to get into it right now. I have an interview coming to you. Also, tweets of the month. I have the terrific the seven most helpful coaching tweets of the past month. And like I said, an interview with strength and conditioning coach Tommy HANSEN, who will be sharing out what are the most believed misconceptions in youth baseball when it comes to strength and conditioning. He will also share out some key tips for running effective competitions at practice or in the training environment. So we're going to get into that shortly. Now for the tweets of the month. Number one, this tweet is by Steve Springer at Quality at Bats. And Coach Springer said, breathe. When we're playing with tension, anxiety, and pressure, the game speeds up. When we're playing with calmness, toughness, and focus, the game slows down. To sum it up, when we're playing in the moment, when the players and kids are focused in the moment, the game slows down the most. There are ways to slow the game down. One simple one is have routines. Have each kid have a routine for hitting, for pitching, for defense, for base running. Having routines gives them something to anchor their thoughts to. So that quote by Steve Springer, when we're playing with tension, anxiety, and pressure, the game speeds up. When we're playing with calmness, toughness, and focus, the game slows down. That's a really good one. Here's another really good one from Casey Combs, who tweeted, or I should say retweeted, a tweet from The Catching Guy. So Casey Combs at CCOMBS2. Casey said, as a quoted retweet, he said, in his first spring training with the Marlins, he said, I was doing this to work on my pops, and my catching coordinator said, that's cute. Now just sit there and catch the ball. It's a bullpen. Now, what Casey was doing, and there's a little video here, and I'll describe it. It's pretty easy to describe. He was the catcher catching bullpens, and when the pitch would come in, he'd catch it, then he'd pop up like he was mimicking a throw to second or to third base or to first base. So he would catch the pitch coming in, and instead of just catching it and flicking it back or throwing it back to the pitcher, he would, in between, he would catch it and work on his footwork to prep a throw, to split his feet, to get his feet into a good throwing position and transfer the ball to his hand. He'd do everything but zip the ball back like a full throw. He'd go through the full throwing motion up until the throw, and then he'd pause and then throw it back to the pitcher. It's interesting that Casey was told by these coaches, this is the opposite of the out-of-box thinking, the we do it this way, it's done this way, we've always done it this way mindset that I saw in professional baseball and even in college baseball, but definitely more so in professional baseball. It was so stuck in their ways. This idea that the catcher is going to affect what the pitcher's doing after the pitcher's already released the ball, and what the catcher was doing was literally taking a split second. Most catchers can catch a ball and throw it down to second base in about 2 seconds-ish. I know those pop times vary. The best in baseball this last year at the major league level was like a 1.82, and that includes the throw all the way to second base from the catcher. So you can do the math. That's a half a second move or a 0.3 of a second move that the catcher's doing. It doesn't take away at all from the bullpen length of the bullpen, or it doesn't take up a lot of time, I should say. It's interesting that they wouldn't allow him to do this. Years ago, I started doing this with catchers. It was an automatic. In fact, I would require catchers to do some sort of move, whether they would pop up and mimic a throw to second or to first or to third. I would have them mimic that at a minimum every 3 throws. If they wanted to do more, that was fine. Now, I would not have the catchers zip it back to the pitchers or obviously throw it to somebody who's not over at first in a bullpen session or at third. Of course, that's not the setup, that's not the environment, but we throw first with our feet. Athleticism starts with the feet. If you just rely on doing that in catching drills or in scrimmages or games, the catchers are going to get a lot fewer reps. You can literally 10x reps by doing this in bullpens. So I thought that was an interesting tweet that we could learn from. Next, tweet number 3. This one is by Greg McCowan. Having a meeting is not the same as making progress. That is so important for all areas of life. Number 4 by Pat Basil. This is a strength and conditioning coach. Speaking of strength and conditioning coach, we got a good one coming on here in just a minute. Use the 80-20 principle. 80% of your results come from 20% of your efforts. This is what Coach Basil's saying. In training, I think it's closer to 90-10. Just do the 10 to 20% that matters the most and then leave the weight room, in other words. Pat Basil is a coach, a strength and conditioning coach that I follow that I really like. I really like what he's saying. Coach Basil is a big advocate of the 80-20 principle. And he never mentioned the 80-20 principle when I was following him, though. I saw it in his messaging. I thought this coach really gets it. He was talking about these great 45-minute workouts that he would do with these college athletes, diverse teams. In other words, he would do it with all the sports teams, the different sports teams, and he could do a really high-quality 45-minute workout that got results, that covered everything he needed to cover. And speaking of the 80-20 rule, tweet number 4, the fourth of the top 7 tweets of the month by Brian Tracy. Brian Tracy is a well-known business coach. 20% of our activities will account for 80% of our results. Pretty straightforward there. I saw that out. I got to put that out there. It's an 80-20 podcast, 80-20 baseball. Next up, this is from @WinningCoaches. @WinningCoaches, discipline is not punishment. Discipline is changing someone's behavior. Nick Saban. I know I haven't talked a lot about Nick Saban on this podcast. Nick Saban always has really great stuff to say. I don't agree with everything Nick Saban does, but I agree with 99% of it. I'll leave it at that. I do think he yells a little too much, and even with the college athletes, he can get away with it more with college athletes because those are young adults. And I know that's not youth sports, but I'd like to see a little less on that. But hey, who can argue with the other 99% of how he coaches? And he's going to go down as the college football GOAT. The next quote is from Coach Bo. There's another Coach Bo out there on Twitter that I follow. He's got some good stuff. Coach Bo, yeah. So at first I thought, what? This guy's it's a copycat. But then I looked at his Twitter account. He started a couple years before me on Twitter. I was a little late to the Twitter game. But in any case, love the name, and I love this tweet. Teach kids to breathe. Teach kids to breathe in through their nose and out through their mouth. Smell the flowers, blow out the candles. 646. Breathe in for 6 seconds, hold the breath for 4 seconds, breathe out for 6 seconds. That'll help control their bodies. So that's the tweet. Teaching them to breathe. Teach the kids to breathe in for 6 seconds, hold it for 4, breathe out for 6. That timing may vary a little bit depending on the size of kid because of their lung capacity and things like that, or their cardiorespiratory, their VO2 max, things like that. But 646 is not a bad way to start. So there are the 7 top tweets of the month that I found that I saw over the last month. Last but not least, before we jump into the interview with strength and conditioning coach Tommy HANSEN, here is the quote of the week, the coaching quote of the week. Quote, give your team what they need, not necessarily what they want. Kids don't need coaches that cave to all their requests, but rather coaches that will serve their futures best. Anonymous. Quote, give your team what they need as a coach, not necessarily what they want. Kids don't need coaches that cave to all their requests, but rather coaches that will serve their futures best. Remember that every time you go out to the field, because there will be a desire for most coaches, most of us, there will be a desire to please, to have the kids like us. You want them to respect you. You don't want them to be afraid of you and dislike you. You just don't want them necessarily to like everything you do, to guide them to be better human beings. If they like everything you do as a coach and how you lead the team and how you get them going in the right direction for the game that's upcoming, for the life that is ahead of them, if they like everything you're doing, you're not doing it right. That doesn't mean they need to hate something that you're doing, but they should not embrace everything you do as a coach with cheers. Always keep in mind their wants usually never line up with their needs across the board. Sure, in certain areas they do. They align perfectly. But a lot of times there are areas or things that they want that they don't need, or things that they need that they don't want. And that's called growing up. And so keep that in mind as a coach. Now, part 1 of the Tommy HANSEN interview. Part 2 will come out next week. This is part 1. Here we go. I am here with Tommy HANSEN, a strength and conditioning coach, and he's going to tell you more, but really what resonated when I followed Tommy and I was reading his articles and I was following him on Twitter was the willingness to seek better ways, to find better ways, but not just to be contrarian. He works with youth sports, which is huge, as all you listeners know. I love the message coming from Tommy. Let's start off giving the listeners a little bit of your backstory. What is your backstory, and what has been the path that has led you to where you're at now?
Thanks for having me on. My story is I was a 4-sport athlete in high school. I was the kicker on the football team. I played soccer, played basketball, I ultimately played baseball in college. I played at a junior college, Milwaukee College in Northern Illinois. Then I transferred to Bellevue University, an NAIA school in Omaha, Nebraska, and was part of a 5th place finishing NAIA World Series team, which is a really cool experience. When I was there, I would always spend time with the strength coach, Jake Allward. He got me introduced to a lot of different strength conditioning concepts. I fell in love with it. He let me help out with different assessments on some of the athletes. He let me run some of the sessions with him, be a part of the programming. It was my first mentor. Then after I was with him, I went back home and I interned at Northern Illinois University with their volleyball, men's and women's basketball for a summer. And then I went back to school. My senior season for baseball got cut short of COVID. I moved home. I studied for almost a year, about 9 months. And then I took an internship at TCU with Coach Zach Dakin, where that was one of the best experiences of my life. He's an incredibly intelligent coach and built me up as a coach. I thought I was in a pretty good situation going in, but I studied a lot of his stuff. You can see a lot from books, but seeing it in action gives you a lot more perspective. Not only that, he was very good at helping build up his interns, build up coaches, and I left there with a lot of confidence. From there, I moved back to my hometown again in DeKalb, Illinois. I started my own business called Perform for Life, where I train high school athletes, middle school athletes, some college athletes that fluctuate through the different breaks during the year, summer and winter. And I train a range of baseball, volleyball, basketball, football, pretty much all the sports in high school. So that's where I'm at now.
So what I gather from that is you have that baseball experience. You've been in the trenches as a player to a higher level. And then you went out and you found somebody who was really having a lot of success as a strength coach, specifically in baseball. You went and learned. If I'm a listener, I hear that, I go, wow, this is great. He's played at a higher level. He went out and he's seeking the best information. Now he's come back, and Tommy, you're working with, you said, middle schoolers, high school. And when I think of youth sports, and that's the focus of this podcast, is working with youth coaches. And if their players are listening, that's awesome. I know they do. We're trying to resonate with that level because I'm a big believer that the professional level and the college level is saturated with coaching and coaches that want to coach at that level. There's a lot of reasons, but the youth sports, I believe, is well underserved. If you just look at the sheer numbers of how many youth coaches there are and things like that. And also you're in Illinois, and the show has a lot of listeners that are in northern or colder weather areas. And so I've seen some of your good video on your YouTube channel. I've seen indoor workouts going on, and I know you're from Illinois, so it makes sense. All right, Tommy, thank you for sharing your backstory and your path to this point. I think it's good for coaches to hear that. And I think it's good for us to hear that what got you to this point as not just credibility, but resonate and connect with you more than just your name. Thank you for sharing that. And then how can people get in touch with you? How can they find you? I just like to get that out there because you volunteer your time for our listeners. You volunteered this time away from your family to come on here. How can they get in touch with you, reach out to you, find your stuff?
I primarily post most of my content on Instagram. So if you just look up my name, Tommy Hansen 88 or Tommy.Hansen 88 on Instagram, Tommy_Hansen 88 on Twitter. I have Tommy Hansen 1288 on TikTok. And then I have a company Perform for Life page. That's the name of my company on Facebook. You can check that out as well. I've got a website. I've got some articles on my website. It's called performforlifetrainingsystems.com. But if you want to get the best glimpse of what I do for all of my athletes, because I do post pretty regularly, I would go to Instagram, Tommy.Hansen88. I post a lot about vertical jump, a lot about baseball, a lot about rotational training, snippets and actionable information that people can take, such as how to improve your sleep, different nutritional protocols, different stuff like that, to give people actionable information, because it is a very saturated world out there when you look online. Depending on the way you frame a Google search, you can get a bunch of different answers on how to get stronger, what you should eat, all that stuff. I try to take all of that complex information and put it into a few Instagram boxes that people can actually take and use as actionable steps to help themselves. If you want to check out most of what I do, I would go to my Instagram page.
If they're in your area or near you, they can reach out and visit you, work with you also. The Instagram is interesting. My wife does the Instagram. I haven't moved over too much. I need to get more on that. It's interesting how these social media platforms benefit all of us, and you can connect with people that you'd never be able to even connect with, or you'd have a smaller chance of connecting. One follow away from following you, Tommy, out there in Illinois. It could be a coach anywhere, and we have listeners all around the world. Or on Twitter, just following that conversation of somebody that you never be able to get in the room with, like an Elon Musk. We're not going to be able to get in a room with them, but we can go listen to what his thoughts are and things like that. So it's really cool. And I think one recommendation for youth coaches, I think you should have, if you can, separate your youth coaching follows from your other feed if you can. And so when you go into coaching mode, you go, all right, I got Tommy on here, and you have some other coaches that you might follow. And I think that's always a good recommendation. With that said, strength and conditioning, that's your thing. Your strength and conditioning now goes across a lot of different sports, which is awesome. And I think gives you more credibility. I think that's great that you have not just the experience of coaching baseball. When it comes to strength and conditioning, what do you think are a few of the most believed myths out there in youth baseball? What are the things that people believe? What are some of the things that are widely believed that you don't think are true or not completely true?
So one of the biggest ones, and this is something I've posted a lot about on the past, particularly on my Instagram page. So when I frame this question, I like to talk about it in an integrated unit. Strength and conditioning and sport practice and skill, they aren't separate entities. They both have their unique identities to them, but they ultimately blend together. One thing that I'm really passionate about talking about is sport specialization. I know I mentioned that earlier when I did my intro, was I'd never specialized in a sport. I never played any travel programs. I never did any travel baseball programs over the summer, travel basketball programs. It was mostly just the local seasonal competitions. And I think there's a myth or a misunderstanding out there that in the frame of this podcast is youth sports, that you have to specialize at a very young age to get the opportunity to play in college, or you'll fall behind a lot of these kids, which there is truth to that. Kids that do specialize will have more exposure because they're in these bigger tournaments. They're getting seen by more coaches at a younger age. And the more you're seen, the more likely you are to get recruited by a lot of these coaches. At the same time, you never know what kids are going to be the late bloomers. You never know which kids are going to burn out, which kids are going to fall in love with the sport. There's no one set path for a lot of these kids. And I think the belief that you have to specialize early to get this opportunity is not necessarily true. Where I get real passionate about this is the approach that many people take on the specialization route. A lot of times is very randomly applied stressors. So you'll have kids that'll play tournaments. They won't play for a few weeks. They'll have sporadic practices. Their parents will sign up for a random weekend elite pitching camp or something like that. They haven't thrown in 2 weeks. Then their arm's bothering them because they have a random spike in workload. So it's not necessarily specialization, I think, that is the issue for a lot of these kids. It's the fact that a lot of parents are trying to do what's best for their kids, but they don't necessarily know what the best plan of action is for them. And there's a lot to it. One big thing for those kids is they should be at least entertaining the idea of being with a strength and conditioning coach, whether it's only 1 or 2 times a week. Strength and conditioning coaches can help them. Strength and conditioning coaches on a baseball staff can really be beneficial from a workload management standpoint, understanding what different pitch loads are, the demand that is on the body, how that impacts what's going on in the weight room, just settling a lot of those randomly applied stressors and how to navigate that. So I think if you can get involved with a strength and conditioning coach in your area that has experience with a lot of these kids and can help you navigate through the sport specialization, that could be massive for a lot of these kids. It's not necessarily the specialization. I think it's the route that many take for the specialization that might lead to a lot of the burnout that we see. That's number one. Number two, this one is still a really commonly held belief in youth sports, and that's what age should kids be throwing curveballs? For me, it's another thing that the nuance of this discussion isn't really discussed all that much. It's hard to discuss all the different factors on a short tweet or a Instagram post. I'm going to unpack this a little bit. When it comes to curveballs for kids, I don't necessarily have an age where I would recommend a kid starts throwing a curveball or not, because it all depends on what their competency as a player is when they're throwing a pitch. If you look at the American Sports Medicine, the Academy of Sports Medicine, they've even said themselves that the curveballs aren't necessarily inherently more dangerous than throwing fastballs for kids. There's a lot of opinion in a lot of that research, but there isn't sufficient evidence to say that curveballs are necessarily more dangerous than fastballs. So when you look at that, it's a commonly held belief, but when you look at what has been shown in a lot of the research, that's just not necessarily true. That's one thing, but how do we go about that? How do we preach that to parents? When it comes to preaching at the parents, I would say that there's not necessarily an age to throw a curveball, but your eyes will tell you what the best plan of action for that kid is. If you got a 10 or 11-year-old kid that just starts spinning curveballs and it looks pretty decent, they can show that they can throw that pitch and catch play. They've been practicing it on the mound of practice with some of their teammates. They've been doing it pretty well. I'd say go ahead and throw it. I don't think it's necessarily dangerous for them. Now, if you have a kid that's the same age, but what they're doing is when they're throwing the pitch, it looks all wonky. It doesn't look like it's very safe. Your eyes could probably tell you whether or not you should be continuing to pound that with that kid or not. There's a lot of nuance in that discussion, but it's very common. You've probably heard it yourselves. I hear it all the time. Kids should not be throwing curveballs at this age. They should wait till they're 13 or 14 or whatever the age is. I think that it's a person by person basis. And as a coach, you should be able to navigate that. Those are the two big ones for me is curveballs and specialization. And I think we need to provide a lot more nuance to that discussion, rather than just saying one is good, one is bad.
I'll tell you what, the way you explained that out was awesome. And I try to go into listener mode when I'm hearing you talk. And I think two things really stood out. And I got this thought about the cookie cutter approach in baseball. The baseball world is full of Twitter, Instagram. The ABCA convention will have 40 speakers coming up in a week or two. And the word cookie cutter comes up in every speech. And then we turn around in the same sport, youth sports, and they say, don't throw a curveball before this age. Is there no cookie cutter approach? Do we want to avoid the cookie cutter approach, or do we want to stick to the cookie cutter approach? Because if you're saying, hey, 12 years old is the cutoff, or 16 years old is the cutoff, or whatever, there's a coach out there that I've been following forever. I used to go to his trainings before a lot of people really bought into it. In fact, I would have to hide that I was studying and using his strategies and his programs and his system. Now he's blown up and he's got 100,000 followers on Twitter, which is pretty massive on Twitter. And I remember him coming out and saying, you shouldn't throw a curveball by this age. And then he would turn around in the next tweet and say, hey, you can't have a cookie cutter approach. We got to avoid the cookie cutter approach. I don't know. I think that brings up something that we need to, or the listeners, I think we need to be careful. And even myself and all of us is, hey, or if they're saying one thing, is that hold true across the board? If they're saying no cookie cutter approach, and then these pitch recommendations from ASMI are essentially, I had an episode a couple of weeks ago that said, this is a cookie cutter approach. I'm not against the pitch recommendation, total pitch counts. I'm not against it, but inherently it's a cookie cutter approach. And I like how you brought that up. And the other thing you said, this got me thinking too, is young players, get a strength and conditioning coach, get involved with the strength and conditioning coach. If you get one thing out of this episode, listeners, I think that is such a nugget of just something to take and run with. Go get your kid into a strength and conditioning coach. You know, if they're 6 or 7U, maybe Tommy can hit on 7, 8U, 9U. Maybe there's another approach. But definitely middle school, get into a strength and conditioning coach. Make sure that is figured out first before you start going out and spending hundreds and thousands of dollars on a pitching coach. I think what you said there was just really great, Tommy. I get excited when I hear this stuff. And do you want to add it to anything I said, or do you want to move to the next question?
I'll add a little bit to that. So that's one thing that you'll come across a lot is parents are very willing to throw a lot of money to a weekend showcase or a weekend elite speed camp or an elite pitching event or hitting event where they're getting this elite instruction. But a lot of times the solution for those kids, they need to have a projectable quality in the first place. So I'll tell us a lot of my high school athletes that like to go and do a lot of these showcases from all sports, whether it's volleyball, baseball, soccer. These weekend events are great for exposure, but you need to make sure before you go to these events, you have a quality in which you can give them that'll give you that exposure and grab their attention. And a lot of times, and what I've found is a lot of it is that physical limitation. These kids are playing nonstop. So when you look at what a lot of coaches are looking at, if you go to a weekend tournament, the kid that's throwing ultra hard and has that bigger body is automatically going to attract a lot of the coach's attention just from initially looking at them. So it's not, even though he might have command issues, he might have this, he might have that, just having that physical capacity that's ahead of your peers is already a foot in the door. Naturally, the coaches want the kids that throw the hardest, jump the highest, run the fastest. Now, a lot of that's genetic, but a lot of kids, and a lot of the stories you hear in a lot of these different pro and these professional and college stories and how these kids get the scholarship, they worked their butts off for 4 years, developed the physical capacity that they didn't have previously, and they got their chance late. And going back to the sports specialization concept that we talked about earlier, this is your late bloomer, someone who put a lot of the work in and became overnight story, but it's not an overnight story. They took the time and they prioritized training for a long time. Just because you're doing both of them simultaneously doesn't mean that they're being integrated in their max capacity. So what I mean by that is, say you have a baseball player that is undergoing their summer baseball, and they have tournaments every other weekend. They've got 2 practice or 3 practices during the week. They come to lifting twice a week, but it's after practice when they're already tired. They're not getting a lot out of it. Even though they're doing both things simultaneously, that lifting's probably in a maintenance mode or almost just hanging on for dear life so they don't decrease their performance at all. It's not by any means optimized. So you have to find the blend of where during the year where you should prioritize training and when you should prioritize playing. And if it's 50-50, you'll never push the envelope on either of them. And the issue is that most parents want to put more money toward the skill side when in fact, especially in the high school, a little bit in middle school, but middle school is an introductory phase, but mostly in high school, when they start specializing a little bit, the physical aspect gets put on the back burner. And most parents aren't willing to put $200, $300 a month into that strength conditioning bucket, when in fact, that's what a lot of the kids need. So if you're a parent listening to this, if your kid is not involved in a strength conditioning program, or at least overseen by someone that's in strength conditioning, or doesn't prioritize it anytime during the year, that's probably a low-hanging fruit that you could attack and get a lot out of.
Awesome. I couldn't agree more with that recommendation. And if I didn't, I'd try to poke some holes in it and see if we could get to a better understanding. But I love what you're saying. And when I hear you talk about the nuances, and right off the bat, you just come out and say it's not black and white, you start using the word nuances, that to me is a green flag. We have red flags. That's a green flag. I hear that and I go, that's a green flag. In other words, listeners, when you hear that, when you hear the word nuances at the beginning of an answer, like Tommy's been using, that to me is a green flag. In other words, okay, now you've piqued my interest a little bit more. Now you've upped your credibility. It doesn't guarantee that I'm going to believe everything or just trust it right then and there, but it definitely moves up my trust level with you when I hear nuances, because that's how life is. You could have 3 kids, your own kids. We have listeners that probably have 3 or 4 of their own kids, and those 3 kids are very different. Those 4 kids might be very different. So our approach needs to be to fit that. It needs to be nuanced. And I love when I hear that word nuanced.
So I know sometimes that can get taken out of context when I say that they should that the physical capacity or their physical training or their sports performance, whatever they're doing with a strength conditioning coach should be the priority. I'm not implying that they stop playing the sport at that time. I'm just implying that during practices, they structure practice in a way that allows strength conditioning to reap as many benefits as possible. All I mean by that is, if your priority is lifting during that specific time of year, your practice demands need to make sure that they match what is going on in the weight room. So if you're throwing and say you got a long toss day or something like that, do your long toss. Don't absolutely kill yourself in practice. Give yourself an opportunity to get as much as you can out of the weight room. Typically, I like to match them up. So if you long toss one day, that should be your tougher day in the weight room. The overall message is you don't have to stop playing your sport during that time. You just have to make sure that you're structuring practice in a way that training can be optimized. And just because you're doing both simultaneously doesn't mean that's necessarily happening. And sport coaches and strength and conditioning coaches that do put these 2 things together is unmatched. And it should be happening more often, but unfortunately it's not. If you aren't doing it already, it can be a massive low-hanging fruit that can yield a lot of benefit for your athlete all year round if you structure it in a way that they both work together and aren't separate entities.
I love your phrase, the low-hanging fruit. Strength and conditioning. It's not easy, but it's probably not as easily accessible. Strength and conditioning, I think it might not be as readily available as that pitching coach who gives lesson down the street or the hitting coach. Maybe that's an area down the road you have a huge influence on in your career, just building that up. That'll be great to see, because I couldn't agree more. Getting kids stronger, but it's not just strength. And maybe we can get into this in a little bit. It's not just strength. That's part of it, but there's definitely some other parts to the strength and conditioning. So now I want to dive into what you think are the 2 or 3 of the biggest needle movers for strength and conditioning at the youth baseball level.
Number 1 would be consistency by far, especially at the youth baseball. So when I talk youth baseball, I'm typically referring to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, your middle schoolers, because that's usually when I start kids on strength and conditioning programs. I usually don't start younger than that, unless if the kids that I already have younger brothers that just want to come and have some fun and they get to join every once in a while. I'll do that. But I'm primarily talking about 6th, 7th, and 8th graders here. You don't underestimate the power of just lifting and training 2 days a week for all 3 years in middle school. The issue a lot of people will run into is that sport ramps up so quickly over the summer and they lose and they don't train for several months. Where a lot of people tend to run into problems is that they'll train 3 or 4 days out of the week during the winter, and then they'll drop all of it once the summer starts and all their stuff picks up. Now, it's understandable when they're playing more, they're not going to have quite as much time for it. But I would much rather see a kid dedicate 2 days a week, every week of the year for 3 years. That's 312 sessions over the course of 3 years. And because of how adaptable kids are and just their bodies maturing and the consistency of an applied stimulus in the weight room, doing that twice a week is an absolute game changer. So it doesn't have to be anything crazy. Just dedicate 2 hours a week, 2 sessions all year round, as consistently as possible. Get 2 to 3 days in a week for these kids over the course of their entire middle school career. And once they're mature and ready to hit the ground running in high school, They'll already be prepared. They'll know how to do the lifts. They'll know how to do all of that stuff. Consistency is key. People like the quick transformations and the quick results, but consistency over a long period of time is where the real results will manifest. Second one I would say is if you want to drive really good intent with a lot of your youth athletes, just create an environment that's breeding that intent. For the youth athletes, it's very basic. It's just teaching them how to squat, how to hinge, how to do a trap bar deadlift, how to find what actual external rotation should feel like on their J-band exercises or on a cable exercise, just teaching them how to do those things, but doing it in a way that breeds intent. Give them all competitions, give them races, give them jump mats to jump on with the competition piece that drives that intent. Not only for youth athletes, for any athletes, if you can put those three things together in your program, the results will speak for themselves. So that's my trifecta. When we look at the needle movers, are they training consistently? Are they training with intent once they're competent enough to do all these different exercises that they've been taught automatically and they do it in the right way? And can you breed intent along, or not breed intent? Can you put it in a competitive environment? If you let them compete with intent and have consistency over the course of 3 years in middle school, very consistently, you'll be in a really good spot. And when it comes to needle movers, it's probably those two things: consistency, competition, which competition will breed intent. So it's the trifecta. That's my approach with the youth sports and strength conditioning.
Consistency and intent. The consistency, I think, for the listener is pretty easy to digest and go out and implement. It makes me think of this, and I've used this with players and students, or even adults. And that is, if I said, we're going to go walk a marathon, 26.2 miles, and they go, whoa. Or if you tell an adult that, I feel like there's almost a sense of anxiety. Hey, I want you to walk a marathon. And there's that sense of anxiety. Say, well, what about this? What if we take that marathon and we break it up every day and we just say, I want you to go out and walk briskly for 15 minutes. Most people can walk a mile in 15 minutes if they're walking briskly. And that adds up to over 14 marathons a year. 14 marathons a year. And they go, wow, 14 marathons. That's awesome. I think just breaking it up with the consistency. And like you're saying, if you did 2 workouts a week for 3 years, man, that's a ton. It's not about going hard. It's about consistency. And that's huge. I've been doing a workout. I've been consistently working out. I'll be turning 42 here in about a month. And I've been working out consistently for about 8 years now. I had a yo-yo workout, right? I had the yo-yo, like the yo-yo diet. I had the yo-yo workout. My diet was never yo-yo. It was always bad. Now it's good. But my workout was yo-yo. I'd work out for 6 months and then quit for 8 months and work out for 4 months and quit for a year. And what I realized was doing less and just being consistent. I found myself going, what's the maximum that I want to do or that I'm willing to do without quitting and consistently doing this from now until, man, hopefully the rest of my life. And I've got it down to about every other day for 30 minutes. That's a workout, not walking or being active or going for a hike or riding a bike, but just a workout in the garage. And that's my cap, 30 minutes every other day or 4 days a week. And that's my cap. So as a youth coach or a parent, you ask yourself, what's the max we can get our kids to a strength and conditioning coach? That's a good question to ask. So how many days a week can we get them there? And if it's 1, then it's 1. Obviously 2 would be great. But like you're saying, it's not about doing more in just this 6-week hit, this 6-week span, or this 2 or 3 month span, but consistency over time. Less is more. And that's really what I got out of that, number 1. And the number 2, intent. I want to dive into this a little bit more. You are big on competitions, and I'm a big fan of competitions because it elevates the intent, the effort. Maybe you could dive in a little bit about competitions, and we're going off script here a little bit. Maybe some things that you use or just how you use competitions to elevate the participation and the intensity.
Sure. When it comes to competition, I like to break it down in 2 ways. It's just an easy way to remember it. 1, I say compete against each other. And then number 2, compete against a machine. So all a machine means is technology. So what I'll do is if they ever jump, say they're doing a broad jump. If they're doing a broad jump, they're competing against everyone else in that group. So they'll do some hurdle jumps and then I'll end it with a broad jump, or I'll have them jump over a stack of hurdles who can jump over the most safely, of course. If you put kids in an environment that's competitive, inherently they want to win. Most kids will want that. So there's some kids that might not jive in that environment, but from my experience, most kids like the idea of competing for something of value. When we're doing broad jumps, they're jumping as far as they can. I put like a little cone out to whoever jumps the farthest. If they're in between some of their lifts, I'll throw a just jump mat out and they'll all jump and compete and see who can jump the highest on the day. And I'll put their numbers up on the wall, or I'll show them their numbers to them before the day starts. So they have a benchmark to beat. Just giving them different opportunities of competition and driving, because intent is what's ultimately going to impact what adaptations go on in the weight room. When I start with kids, intent's not the biggest thing, but that's only early on. If they're just learning a movement, I care what the movement looks like first. If they show they're competent in the movement, I start telling them, move the weight as fast as you can, jump as high as you can, and those type of things. How fast you're moving the bar and how fast you're moving is ultimately going to drive the adaptations. Competing against each other, I'll have them run sprints. I'll have them pick up tennis balls. I'll have anything that involves a fun implement that drives max intent. So the way I like to phrase it is creating an environment that they think is play, but low key as a strength coach, it's breeding intent. So they think it's just fun games when they're racing and doing concept. But to me, it's driving intent laterally. It's driving intent in a sagittal plane. All these different things technically matter to me, but the kids view it as a game. Even in high school, like the kids that come in, they don't like just sprinting by themselves and running in lines. Make them race, put some at disadvantages, put them in cool starting positions, add an implement in the end. I have them knock over foam rollers. Just put them in any kind of way that drives intent in a creative way that they think is play or fun. But as a strength coach, just driving intent and driving adaptation. When it comes to competition, either do that via machine or some sort of technology that allows them to see their actual the quantitative feedback, or have them race and compete against one another. And when you do those two different things, intent goes through the roof. And that's why I typically prefer that kids train in groups rather than one-on-one. Even high schoolers or anybody in general, they do better in groups because that intent that's driven by competition of others is unmatched.
Well put. Really like that message. And I've shared out one of the best friends of a coach in youth sports or any level is a stopwatch. All right, we're going to pause the interview right there. We'll come back to part 2 next week. So be sure to check in next Tuesday when the next episode gets published, when it goes live. Next week, Tommy is going to answer the question, is there something you are doing as a coach that you believe is different than most coaches or ahead of the curve? So Coach HANSEN will answer that next week, along with a few other things he's going to share out that are really helpful tips. And be sure to head over to 8020baseball.com. Articles, videos, coaching tutorials, drill design guide ready for you over there. So be sure to head over there. Follow on Twitter, 8020_baseball, 8020_baseball. Support the podcast by leaving a review, a quick review or a rating or a donation. There's a link in the show notes where you can make a donation to keep this rolling along. Email me your success stories also. Love hearing the success stories from all you coaches that are using this 80-20 baseball system. I know it works. It's been proven to work. The coaches where we've taken and extracted a lot of this amazing information from, it's working for them. It works. And I love hearing the success stories from coaches. Until next week, take care of yourself, your health, your families, those close friends, and take this information out there and apply it to your team. Apply it, implement it, put it into action, get it going, throw it out there, start using it because it does no good if it's just stored up in your brain. You got to put it into action, right? So go out there, start using it, start putting it in, plan out how you want to implement it, when you want to implement it, but get it implemented, start using it. And until next week, adios.
This has been the 80-20 Baseball Masterclass. Take it to the field.